These aren't just the worst two-strokes that faded into US history. It's a graveyard of motors so chaotic, some mechanics still refuse to talk about them. We are going to show you which major brands you thought you trusted were selling lemons, which disastrous motors helped sink entire companies, and which shocking engineering mistakes changed the course of American boating. If you're bored of the reliability of today's modern four-strokes, and strangely crave some chaos of smoky twos, you're about to see a mechanic's warning that might save you thousands. When you started this engine, you might have thought, how can an inanimate object actively hate you? Well, the Johnson RD22 did. This thing had a reputation for kickback so violent, mechanics joked it should come with wrist guards. Owners would pull the starter rope, and the engine would pull back harder, like you wanted to fight for dominance. You didn't start it, you negotiated with it. But the real trademark flaw, the legendary juke problem, jumping out of gear. Imagine cruising along, everything's fine, then suddenly your engine decides, you know what, neutral sounds fun. And boom, you go from planing to drifting like a confused paddleboarder. It wasn't dangerous, unless you count emotional damage. To be fair, the RD22 wasn't a total villain. When it actually stayed in gear and didn't kick your arm off, it made decent power. But reliability, well, let's just say Johnson's engineers probably pretended someone else built this one. Today it lives in outboard folklore as a lovable disaster, the kind of motor collectors keep around just to remind themselves how far we've come. If the late 90s had an outboard villain, Ficht would be the one twirling the mustache. Evinrude bet big on this futuristic direct injection system, and turned it into the corporate equivalent of stepping on a rake. On paper it was genius. Clean emissions, great fuel economy, modern tech. In reality, scorched pistons, injector meltdowns, and detonation that made grown mechanics wince. The real heartbreak is that OMC doubled down. They were so desperate to beat Mercury and Yamaha that they pushed Ficht out before it was ready. The engines ran beautifully for some people, right up until the moment they didn't. And when they blew spectacularly. We're talking about engines that looked like they lost a boxing match to themselves. This wasn't just a bad motor. This was the motor that helped drag a legendary American brand into bankruptcy. So yes, Ficht earns its place on this list not because it was weak or slow, but because its flaws were historic. Modern collectors treat these engines like radioactive art pieces, interesting to look at, dangerous to touch. On the surface, Yamaha's big 3.3-litre HPDI looks like a warrior. It's powerful, efficient, and sounds like something that belongs on a battleship. But under the cowling, a fragile diva with a chronic fuel problem. These engines were famous for scoring pistons faster than some motors could finish a tank of gas. All it took was one injector acting up, and boom, your powerhead became modern art. The HPDI's Achilles heel was its high-pressure fuel system. If anything, and I mean anything in that chain wasn't perfect, the whole engine would start spiraling. Air pumps, filters, injectors, even the wrong brand of fuel stabilizer could send it into meltdown mode. Mechanics still talk about these the way war veterans talk about difficult memories. And the best part, when they were healthy, they were brilliant. Strong hole shot, great mileage, incredible top end. So owning one was like dating a supermodel who also happened to throw plates when irritated. You loved the highs, feared the lows, and prayed the relationship held together one more season. The early Optimax engines were Mercury's big leap into direct injection two-strokes, and they landed like someone belly flopping off a 30-foot dock. On good days they ran beautifully, crisp throttle response, solid fuel economy, nice power, but on bad days, Well, let's just say the air compressor became a celebrity for all the wrong reasons. When it failed spectacularly, taking injectors, fuel rails, and sometimes the entire mood of your weekend with it. The Optimax was a motor that demanded absolute perfection from its owner. Skip one filter change, use old fuel, forget to sacrifice a goat to the boating gods, suddenly you're drifting home with your cowling off. Staring at a compressor that looks like it aged 40 years overnight, mechanics would see one roll into the shop and immediately check what time they closed that day. Yet, like many engines on this list, they were great when everything lined up. Many owners still swear theirs were reliable. Others, well, they now own 4-strokes. The Optimax legacy is simple. Brilliant idea, occasionally brilliant performance, but an air compressor ticking time bomb that made even loyal Mercury fans sweat. The Chrysler 105, a 4-cylinder beast that looked tough, sounded tough, and died tough. This engine had been singled out by mechanics for decades as one of the most stubborn, overheating, self-destructing lumps ever hung on a transom. It had a habit of seizing power heads like it was trying to win a competition, and if the pistons didn't quit first, the quirky ignition system was there waiting to finish the job. The construction was pure 1970s chaos. Weird bolt placements, parts married together like they'd never been tested, and cooling passages that apparently had trust issues with water flow. Mechanics would groan when one rolled in. Some even claimed Chrysler must have assembled these using a dartboard full of engineering decisions. But here's the funny thing. When properly tuned, the 105 actually ran pretty well. The problem was keeping it that way. For most owners, getting a good week out of it felt like winning the lottery. Today it's remembered as a charming disaster, the kind of motor everyone has a story about, usually ending with, and that's when I switched to a Johnson. If the 501 was the heavyweight disaster, the Chrysler 65 HP was its twitchy little brother with anger issues. This engine had massive exhaust ports, which gave it decent speed, and a terrible durability. From brand new, many of them had a distinctive piston slap sound that was way less high-performance buzz and more someone shaking a toolbox. And the cylinders, they wore unevenly faster than a cheap pair of shoes. The worst part, these engines lulled owners into false confidence. On the first run, you'd think, hey, this thing moves pretty good. Then a few weeks later, you're chasing down misfires, compression loss, or a bore so glazed you could see your reflection in it. Mechanics still joke that the Chrysler 65 came pre-broken from the factory. Still, there's a cult following that loves them because they were light, simple, and speedy when behaving. Unfortunately, keeping one behaving required patience, spare parts, and emotional support. For many boaters, this was the engine that taught them two important lessons. Not everything fast is good, and always bring a paddle. The Force 125 was born during the great Bayliner plus cheap Outboard era, a time when affordability mattered more than, well, almost anything else. The 125 had a simple Chrysler-derived design, which sounds reassuring until you realize that simple in this case meant crude casings, questionable cooling passages, and an ignition system that behaved like it was on a 3-day bender. It was reliable in the same way a coin toss is reliable. Owners often found themselves joining online forums not to customize their boats, but to share survival tips. Overheating? Check. Stalling? Of course. Random loss of spark? Classic force behavior. And don't even get them started on the lower units, which seem to enjoy long romantic walks to the bottom of lakes. Yet somehow the 125 wasn't slow. In fact, performance was one of the only things people liked about it. A big, torquey push that made light boats feel way more exciting than they deserved. But excitement alone doesn't erase frustration. Today, Force 125s are remembered as engines that worked, right up until the exact moment they didn't. On paper, the Suzuki DT-55 should have been a winner. 3 cylinders, decent power, smooth Japanese engineering, but somewhere along the journey from blueprint to boat ramp, things went sideways, particularly in the gearbox department. The lower units on these engines failed so consistently that scrapyards were practically overflowing with DT-55 gear cases stacked like forgotten Lego bricks. Mechanically, the powerhead wasn't terrible. In fact, some owners loved how smooth it ran at idle, but that didn't matter much when your gearbox exploded halfway through the season. Add in a finicky throttle position sensor that could fail at the worst possible moment, and you had a motor that turned simple fishing trips into plot twists. To their credit, Suzuki learned from this one. Later outboards got much better, but the DT-55 still lives on in jokes among mechanics who call it a beautiful powerhead attached to a self-destructing blender. If reliability is measured by how often you make it home under your own power, the DT-55 often failed the test. The Suzuki DT-140 looked like a powerhouse, a sleek, aggressive two-stroke with eye-catching horsepower for its size. But behind that confident exterior lived an engine that was, well, moody. It ran beautifully only when the stars aligned, the carburetors were perfectly synced, the fuel was fresh, the compression matched perfectly, and the wind was blowing at the correct angle. Miss any of those? Welcome to tuning purgatory. Owners loved the top-end power, but they quickly learned the DT-140 had a temper. It was extremely sensitive to fuel quality and mixtures. Get things even slightly off and the engine could bog, stutter, or run hotter than a cheap grill. Mechanics spent half their time adjusting carbs, and the other half wondering why they even agreed to work on these. To make matters worse, durability wasn't exactly legendary. Over the years, more and more DT-140s developed issues staying in tune or maintaining consistent compression. Many modern boaters call it the engine that made me carry a toolkit everywhere. Fun when running, frustrating when not. The DT-140 was the definition of a high-risk relationship. Imagine walking into Sears in the 1970s and buying an outboard the same way you'd buy a lawnmower. That was the Gamefisher. Cheap, lightweight, and built by Esker using Tecumseh powerheads. These motors were essentially lawn equipment pretending to be outboards, and honestly, they performed like it. Their favorite hobby was refusing to start unless you followed the correct ritual: fresh fuel, quiet surroundings, and maybe a small prayer. The biggest issue was the ignition system. It had all the consistency of a moody teenager. One minute you had spark, the next the motor acted like electricity had been outlawed. Carburetors were just as fussy, often clogging, leaking, or flooding at the exact moment you needed them most. Add in cheap materials and minimal corrosion protection, and you had a motor that aged faster than a banana left in the sun. Yet, for all their flaws, the Gamefishers had charm. They were cheap, simple, and light enough to lift with one hand, but long-term reliability, not their speciality. Today they're mostly remembered as that engine grandpa cursed, and honestly, that feels accurate. If you thought the Gamefisher was basic, wait until you meet its loud, vibrating cousin, the air-cooled Esker Ted Williams motors. These engines skipped water cooling entirely, relying instead on airflow and determination. The result? Noise, heat, and enough vibration to loosen your fillings. Some owners joked these motors didn't need a kill switch, you just waited until the shaking made the fuel line fall off. The real problem with air-cooled two-strokes on boats is simple. They run hot, really hot, and Esker never quite figured out how to manage that heat without stressing the engine. Over time, parts warped, seals cucked, and performance faded like a bad memory. Combined with an ignition system that was, let's call it, ambitious, these engines became a mechanic's recurring nightmare. But the funniest part? People still bought them because they were cheap, simple, and sold at Sears next to the washing machines. Today they survive mostly as collectors' curiosities, relics from a time when people said, "Hey, how bad can an air-cooled boat engine be?" Answer: pretty bad. McCulloch wanted to revolutionize the market with their sleek, low-profile two-strokes, and visually nailed it. These engines looked futuristic, clean, even aerodynamic, but once you pulled the cowling off, the illusion disappeared fast. The internals were cramped, awkward, and notoriously hard to wrench on. Mechanics still talk about these motors with the same tone people use when describing traumatic life events. Performance wasn't the issue. When tuned, they ran decently. The real problem was the internal layout, which seemed designed by someone who had never touched a toolbox. Basic jobs required disassembling half the engine. Lower units failed more often than you'd expect, and parts availability vanished quickly once McCulloch bowed out of the outboard business. Many surviving units now sit in sheds, not because they're collectible, but because nobody wants to touch them. Owners describe these engines as cool to look at, terrible to own, which feels perfectly accurate. The low-profile McCullochs are a lesson in marine history. Innovation is great, but not if nobody can maintain it. Ah yes, the British Seagull, the outboard that refuses to die, even when you kind of wish it would. These post-war two-strokes were sold in the US for years, usually to people who valued one thing, simplicity. And to be fair, they delivered it. A carburetor, a spark plug, and what looked suspiciously like plumbing pipe, but performance. Let's just say a strong wind could outpace a healthy Seagull. The Seagull's biggest flaw was its everything. They smoked like a chimney, guzzled fuel, leaked oil, and vibrated with the same elegance as a shopping trolley with one bad wheel. Starting them required the patience of a monk and an arm made of rope, and once running, they produced a sound that could only be described as a weed whacker trapped inside a metal bucket. Yet for all the chaos, Seagulls developed a cult following. People loved their stubborn simplicity. You could drop one off a dock, pull it back up, dry it with a towel, and it would still run. But in modern boating terms, these engines belong in museums, preferably behind glass, where they can't hurt anyone. Buying a Sea King from Montgomery Ward was the marine equivalent of buying a discount TV. Sure, the price was right, but longevity, that was another story. Many of these two-stroke Sea Kings were built by Chrysler or later Force, which meant they inherited all the quirks. Weak drivetrains, finicky carburetors, and drive shafts that occasionally just snapped. Not great qualities for an engine keeping you off the rocks. The construction quality was inconsistent at best. Some units ran surprisingly well, others seemed to be built on a Monday morning. Shifting issues were common, with gearboxes that acted more like suggestions than mechanical systems, and because they were sold through a department store, support was minimal. Once they aged out, parts availability evaporated like smoke. Still, they were cheap, and for plenty of families, a Sea King was their first outboard. That nostalgic glow hides the reality that these motors spent a lot of time being towed back to shore. Today they survive mostly in barns, sheds, and the occasional Craigslist ad titled, "Runs great, just needs a tune." Now here's the spicy one. Including the E-Tec and G2 on a worst list is like insulting someone's favorite football team. The fans will fight you. But critics, oh, they have stories. These engines were modern, clean, powerful two-strokes with brilliant fuel economy, but behind the innovation lurked expensive ECUs, sensitive sensors, and electrical gremlins that caused some owners to age noticeably faster. The G2 gearbox issues alone sparked online debates longer than some marriages, and yes, the occasional exploding cowling didn't help the reputation. When an E-Tec went wrong, it didn't go gently, it went cinematic, and with OMC long gone, dealer support wasn't always consistent, which meant some owners felt stranded both physically and emotionally. But here's the twist. Many people absolutely love these engines. They rave about the torque, the quiet idle, the no break-in periods, and the clean emissions. That's why this entry is contentious, not definitive. The E-Tec line wasn't universally bad, it was polarizing. For some, it's the best engine they've ever owned. For others, it's the one that made them switch brands forever. What about knowing not just the worst engines, but also the worst hulls? Check out our video where we uncover the worst boat manufacturers that also disappeared into oblivion. But that's the full lineup of the worst two-strokes that we won't be seeing again. The engines that smoked too much, broke too often, and left an unforgettable mark on American boating. If you enjoyed this deep dive into marine disasters, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me which cursed engine you've survived.